I woke to the taste of salt on my lips and the smell of wet wood, as if the ocean had exhaled and left its breath on a boardwalk that had forgotten the sun. Fog pooled around the pilings and threaded the planks like soft rope. It wrapped itself about my ankles like an old coat, heavy and familiar. Carnival lights strung along the rail went out and on through the haze, small stars drowning in a low teal cyan wash. I had the sensation of being an afterimage of myself, edges softened, features slightly wrong, as if someone had rephotographed my life on old film and let the grain do the rest. There was a booth waiting for me, wedged between a shuttered game of strength and a stack of faded prize ducks, the booth of unspoken words. It leaned like a throat that refused to swallow, its awning listless. Its front window was smeared with fogged glass and film grain reflections of neon. Behind the pane a pale hand pressed as if to pinch the glass from within. A tiny mirror lay on a low table inside, its rim dulled and pitted, looking like both invitation and trap. Madame Lyra sat motionless behind it, her robe a pool of deep teal threaded with muted crimson, her hair a black fall punctuated with silver. She did not smile. Her eyes milky, almost sea-washed teal suggested a perpetual listening to things that did not exist in the room. I could not have explained why I walked toward the booth. Compulsion is too pedestrian a word for the pull at the back of my skull. It was older than will, more certain than fear. The boardwalk creaked under a slow wind and the carnival music beyond reached me in fragments detuned like a memory receding. Every step smelled of old paper and incense and the faint, sharp ozone of rain about to fall. I carried my tattered leather journal under my arm and the brass key at my throat on a frayed string. Those objects felt like promises that something could be locked and unlocked, that what I carried might at last be accounted for. At the window the details arrived like small accusations. The booth's paint was cracked. Its neon sign flickered, and the letters of its name, the booth of unspoken words, skipped like a thought that had tripped before completion. The pale hand pressed to the inside of the glass twitched as if listening, as if the glass was a membrane between two languages. Madame Lyra's face was porcelain and fissured faint lines of face paint ran like hairline fractures across her cheeks. She traced a finger at the rim of a blackened silver hand mirror, and my reflection, if it could be called, that blurred and refused to hold. Each ornament, each tiny cracked bell that hung from her sleeve, felt pointed, like brass questions, you withheld again. She made no gesture I could pass as an invitation, yet the door opened without sound. There was no step, no threshold, only the suggestion of crossing a line into a room that existed on the other side of regret. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and distant storms. A single small table bore the mirror. Cast iron lamps with teal and crimson shades threw rim light that turned the shadows into knife edges. The mirror-esque glass was colder than the night, and when I peered down I saw only a blurred shape that might have been me, or might have been the absence of me. Madame Lyra did not speak the words a fortune teller is supposed to speak. She never asked my name or what I sought. Instead, the booth made its trade without ceremony. It offered me a bargain. If I would listen, it would recite the apologies I had withheld, but to hear them would be to see their consequences. Ignorance would remain blissful and sterile, and listening would be cumbersome and real. The cost of every silence I had kept would be shown, as though someone had taken a lantern and illuminated the corners I had left dark. The implication sat across the table like a small, certain gravity: listen and bear, or turn away and carry the quiet forever. The first apology arrived like a breath against the mirror. It was soft and not spoken by a mouth I could see. The booth's voice felt like the scraping of a quill across brittle paper. It showed me a night years ago, the kind of domestic small tragedy that never gets the headline. There had been a dinner, plates bright with steam, a conversation folding into itself like a map being refolded the wrong way. I had wanted to say the thing that would have softened the moment, and I am sorry, or a soft concession, but I had not. The consequence unspooled as a tableau laid over the room like a translucent film, a table scattered with a half-finished meal, a photo folded at an angle on the mantel, a slow, decisive retraction of a hand from mine. The image cut into me with cold clarity. It was not accusatory, never that, but it had the arithmetic of omission. For every apology unpaid, there was a small subtraction in someone's life. The memories came like tidewater, slow, steady, each one a very particular H. They were not the tidy, cinematic flashes I had rehearsed in private, no neat backlighting or clarifying line, but granular, the H of an upper arm where a hand had not fallen. The hollow left by the sound of a name unsaid, the texture of silence at the edge of a child's bright question. The booth projected not only what had not been said, but the way those silences worked in the world, raw loneliness biding in a corner. A photograph whose margins frayed with neglect, a garden left untended until it remembered how to vanish. Each withheld phrase became a weight dropped into my chest. My ribs felt as if they were being pressed by small, cool stones. I tried to step back, to leave the booth and let the fog take me and my journal and my key away. The boardwalk, however, refused. It rearranged itself gently like a dream adjusting to keep its protagonist in frame. A plank shifted underfoot, and I found myself mired in the booth's gravity. The carnival beyond drew its lights in like a patient holding its breath. The choice was no longer abstract silence, had a cost measured in rooms that grew small, in shoulders that learned to carry absence like a second coat. The booth offered another apology and another aftermath. A photograph returned to the table, face edges torn, detailing an absence that had ossified into ritual. There was an image of a child who grew up asking for explanations that never came, a place at a table that remained empty because an admission had been withheld. Another scene, a hospital corridor lit by a single green lamp, a phone whose missed call sat like a pulse in the answering machine. A father who learned to curtail his questions. These projected scenes were not cinematic fantasies, but forensic reconstructions of consequences. They felt inevitable, like the slow collapse of a building after a seam is left unattended. The pain of watching was not the same as the guilt of retrospect. Watching made me responsible again, in the present tense. Madame Lyra's attention did not feel neutral. She watched with intimate and menacing concentration. Her movements were fluid. She tilted her head to hear a sound that was not there. She traced the mirror's rim as if rearranging memory itself. Sometimes she would touch a lacquered rune, a small wooden symbol, and the room would shiver. Another scene would bloom in the air like a fog lantern. She handled each image with astonishing tenderness. She gave them back to me like a midwife delivering a truth I had never birthed. Yet there was menace in the certainty with which she offered them. She did not offer absolution, she merely made sure I saw the measure of what I had left undone. As the booth turned its lanterns toward me, the apologies grew in specificity. One showed a birthday left uncelebrated, the unsaid phrase "I was there," I tried, never uttered, because I was embarrassed by my own failings. A tableau of a wedding rehearsal where my silence about a worry small, cowardly allowed a fissure to widen until it became a canyon. An afternoon where I did not enter a hospital room because I feared seeing the decline, and the omission taught someone else to harden. Each scene was an anatomized consequence, precise as an autopsy. They were not meant to make me collapse. They were meant to make me understand exactly how the web of silence spread. At the center of the booth's unspooling was the single apology I had buried above all others, the one that had the power to undo a life if given voice. The booth made that apology take shape and moved the consequences into unblinking relief. I saw a cracked film, plate imager, a phone's unanswered call, the cursor blinking on a message never sent, a name left to echo in an empty hallway. A child who learned to erase the tracks of small injuries because they were never acknowledged, a life that slowly recalibrated itself around absence. The weight of that withheld word was an engine. It drove the air from my lungs, and filled space with a soundless pressure until the mirror on the table fogged over with a breath that was not mine. In that fracture where the apology should have been, something inside me either broke or refused to break. The booth measured with a merciless and precise apparatus the shape of my refusal. It forced me to see how silence becomes a seal, and how a single withheld phrase can be the hinge on which a door is forever closed. I felt the old habit of hiding loosen, then tighten again like a muscle unsure whether to unlearn a posture. There was a brief, ridiculous hope that once the images had been seen, the ledger would clear itself, that the world might fold back into its previous geometry. The booth offered no such mercy, it only catalogued. Between the unspooling scenes there were quieter textures, the sound of bells at Madame Lyra's sleeves, the sibilant rustle of paper as the lamplight passed over her hands, the faint tack of ozone, as if the air itself were being corrected. Once, when a scene showed me stomaching a petty pride, Madame Lyra's fingertips brushed the mirror and the image softened, not erased, but rendered more bearable. It was an act without words, almost human. For a moment I thought perhaps she might guide me toward forgiving myself, but the guide came with caveats. She would not perform absolution, she would only make visible the transactions I had avoided. After the ordeal, the booth offered me a small physical thing, a token, material and ridiculous next to the scale of what it represented. A brass key slid across the table with a soft scrape, or perhaps it was a torn page from my journal, words half-formed, ink running where tears might have fallen, each artifact a partial atonement and also a tally. The key was warm despite the cold of the night, and when I closed my fingers around it, the metal bit into my palm like a truth. Madame Lyra watched me with those milky teal eyes and offered no easy solace. What she gave was a fragment, a ledger entry in the accounts of my omissions. The brass key was oddly ordinary, yellowed, a hairline dent along its bow, but the particularity of that ordinariness made it uncanny. It seemed designed to fit locks I had once known and had forced shut. When I held it against my chest, I could feel its warmth bloom, like a small sun, as if it had been taken from a pocket not long since. It was an emblem both ridiculous and terrible, a tiny piece of the world asking to be matched to whatever door I had kept closed. I left the booth clutching the token. My journal felt heavier than it had an hour before. The carnival swallowed the booth in a slow, sensual fog. The lights bled into the mist, and the Ferris wheel became a halo that turned lazily in the gloom. The last whisper of the booth hovered behind me like a meter reading. There are more apologies, there are more consequences. I had been offered a partial release and a dangerous clarity. My shoulders were heavier, yes, but I could also see the edges of a path that had not been visible before. The choice remained: follow the corridor deeper and summon the rest of what I had left unsaid, or walk away carrying this new knowledge as if it were a stone in my pocket. The boardwalk rearranged itself again, as if to tempt me. Planks seemed to align under my feet in a manner that suggested both invitation and compulsion. I could have turned, stepped toward the thinning fog, and let anonymity swallow me back into the city. Allowed the booth and its ledger to be a one-night exorcism in the fog. Instead, I found my fingers worrying the brass key where it hung on its frayed string. My journal a thing of pages I had never allowed to be legible, open to a blank page, as if inviting a difficult sentence. The last thing the booth had given me was not an instruction, but a pressure refused the next silence. I walked into the fog, and the carnival receded like a story I had once loved and then set aside. The lights dimmed to a distant flutter, and the music thinned into a memory of melody. Madame Lyra's bells chimed faintly behind me, a sound like distant promises or distant weather. The fog clung. The film grain of the world smoothed into a texture that made every sound longer, every light hallowed. The brass key lay against my sternum, a small, ridiculous talisman for a thing that was anything but. If I had learned anything in that booth, it was not that apologies are cures. they are not always medicines to stitch wounds. The booth taught me another, harder fact: silence is not neutral. It is an agent. It does things to the world. It rearranges rooms, trains hands to leave places empty, instructs a child to grow up learning absence as a lesson. Silence is an architecture as precise as a bridge or a lock. What I carried now was a ledger, a key, and the knowledge that to unburden oneself is to risk both repair and recoil. The fog thinned and thickened in cycles as if eavesdropping. I passed a row of closed stalls with tarpaulins pulled tight. A seagull cried and then was gone. I caught myself rehearsing the words I had not spoken, not grand confessions, but small and honest pressures. I was wrong. I should have been there. I didn't know how to ask for help. Phrases I could have offered when it mattered. Each felt both too late and necessary, like opening a window in a house long unventilated. There were other tiny vignettes I could recall, more of the booth's projections slipping back into me now that I had left its immediate geometry. An afternoon at a train station in rain and my thumbs too stiff to call. A question from a friend about whether I would help, and a lie I told to avoid time and trouble. A holiday table where I declined to say the thing that would have diffused a blame cycle. The consequences were not dramatic in the cinematic sense. They were cumulative like rust. Someone learned to accept less. Someone stopped asking. Small refrains became a new melody of loneliness. At the far end of the boardwalk, the city began to reassert itself. A street lamp made a pool of clarity over the wet pavement. I paused beneath it, the brass resting at my throat like a watching insect. The key felt heavier now, not just weight, but significance. I had been given an object and a problem where to use it. Doors I had shut without keys, conversations that required unlocking sat in the dark corners of my life. The booth had not told me which to open, only that a key existed, and that some doors were opened from the outside as well as the inside. I thought of returning to Madame Lyra, of asking whether the key would fit any of the doors she had shown me. But the idea of bargaining appealed to me less than the idea of doing the work. There was a stubbornness in that choice, an attempt to insist on the agency I had ceded to the booth. If the booth measured and catalogued, perhaps I could now, imperfectly, choose to repair. Night tightened around the Ferris wheel, which pulsed like an unblinking eye. I wondered whether the next apology would undo me entirely, or whether voice could be the thing that mends. In the end, the thought of the booth's mirror stayed with me, not because it had offered absolution, but because it had shown the architecture of my omissions clearly enough that the path forward existed. Repair is never clean and never certain, but the alternative continuing to shape lives with the contours of my quiet felt intolerable. The steam of my breath drifted in front of my face, and the fog curled at my feet like a cartographer revising a map. I kept walking because I could not walk. The corridor of the dark had begun to map itself inside me. Perhaps the booth's greatest cruelty and its greatest kindness was that it made continuing a moral labor rather than an accidental habit. Behind me, the booth waited, patient as a question. Ahead, the boardwalk turned, and the carnival promised more mirrors, more tokens, more reckonings. At the first light of an fog pooled around my boots like a slow apology, a soft, unhurried thing that took its time filling the space between me and the wood. The boardwalk sighed beneath my steps, each creak a punctuation I had been dodging for years, as if those joints were the kind that could open wounds. The carnival lights beyond the tents blinked with the wary insistence of machines that had been wounded for longer than the people watching them. Teal and crimson bled into the mist and made the fog look like stained glass. I had come to this pier without a plan, only the dull appetite of a man who had been carrying other people's absence, as if it were his own weight. There was no dramatic impulse that drew me here, no cinematic need to speak, only the slow gravity of a thing overdue. The booth of unspoken words sat crooked among the stalls, its paint peeling like an old confession, the letters on its sign softened by weather and nightly breath. Its narrow window was warped, the glass fogged and crowned with wet streaks where breath and weather met. For a brief, dizzying moment the fog thinned, and the warped glass resolved into a face I had not permitted to exist in anything resembling proximity. Someone I had refused to address for far too long, and recognition hit with the bluntness of ice on bone. I had rehearsed apologies in the small hours so many times that they had become ceremonies of avoidance as tidy. Mechanical ritual meant to soothe the rehearsal's own conscience, rather than the object of contrition. I knew the shapes of the things I had never said their edges, how they would awkwardly wedge into someone else's day, how they might destabilize arrangements that had been constructed around my silence. Standing outside the booth, I felt old muscles clench the private, deep muscles that make the mouth a locked box. The reflection in the window tightened into a remembered hurt, an absence. Then the glass shuttered over it, a slow, merciless blinking, and left a question folded into the dark. The question occupied the space behind my ribs with stubbornness. It would not be dismissed by a practiced inward breath, or by the rationalizations I'd been saving like talismans. The curtain into the booth was thin and smelled of dust and rooms closed for a long time. Pushing through it did not feel like a decision so much as being guided by a hand I could not see, the kind of guidance that presumes you have already consented. Inside, air was colder and the light was the kind that flattens faces into relics and makes time look brittle. Madame Lyra was there as if she had been waiting forever, or as if she had been conjured precisely at the moment I acknowledged my need. She wore a robe that rustled like old pages being turned in a library at midnight. She moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of someone who knows where hinges are and how to open things sealed for years. On the small table between us sat a hand mirror framed in blackened silver. The glass was not polished to comfort, but looked unsettled, alive with a patient, insistent hunger. Her eyes were a milky teal, not the ordinary kind of color, but something like ledger paper stained with mint. They watched me with the cold attention of an account book, checking its totals. She offered the mirror not with chatter, or any of the carnival patter that had become my private antidote to consequence, but with a small tilt of the wrist that functioned as invitation and command in one unspoken movement. I understood what the object promised, not prophecy, not melodrama, but the apology I had withheld given shape and action. There was an odd intimacy in that proposition. It felt like being handed the chance to finish a sentence one had let fester in the dark. The intimacy was not kind, it was surgical. When the mirror turned toward me, it refused to do the simple thing of returning my face. Instead, it unspooled memory like film, frame by frame, each still soundless but charged with consequence. I watched an afternoon I had carefully taught myself to forget light slanting through a kitchen window, a chipped cup with a hairline crack, a chair pulled out a degree too quickly. I saw my hands, the small gestures I had rationalized, how I softened the edges of what I meant until the words changed into something that could be swallowed. I watched myself close my mouth around an apology and leave it there like a swallowed stone. Witnessing that small omission was like seeing a hairline fracture travel across glass. At first it was barely there, a fine line, and then over time it widened until the thing it held began to splinter into other losses. The mirror showed not theatrics, but the precise arithmetic of omission, how one withheld phrase could seed neglect and, eventually, absence. From memory the mirror moved to consequence. The booth shifted inward. The glass became an aperture into the life that could have been shaped differently by a single uttered word. I watched, as if from a distant theater, a life rearranged, loneliness ossified where a word might have softened an edge. Anger took root and nourished itself, because a grievance had never been tended to, and a relationship that had hovered at the margins of both our days calcified into absence. The scene was not accompanied by music. The silence made every small sound the creak of a chair, the unsaid breath louder, more indicting. Each emission felt like someone tightening a band around my chest. The silence occupied a square of space that should have been whole. I felt the truth of each neglected moment, as if a tally were being made inside me, a balancing out of all the blanks I had left. On the table, the lacquered runes lay like a coat of patient witnesses. As the images bled into one another, the runes shifted and clicked faintly, each sound a quiet tally I could not deny. My journal sat beside them, its pages familiar with my handwriting and suddenly foreign in the gaps where ink seemed to have bled into fog and then simply vanished. The brass key, always cold in that peculiar way metal is when it remembers contact, grew colder still, as if the temperature of the world reflected the tally of things I had not offered. Pages of plans and of half-formed confessions began to go blank before my eyes, as though the act of omission had a literal appetite, and the words themselves were consumed for the ledger's sake. Madame Lyra moved with the softness of someone rearranging bones. There was nothing brusque about it, no hurried judgment, only the quiet competence of a practitioner of some austere craft. Her hand hovered near the runes, then settled on the mirror's handle in a way that made the whole thing feel like an altar. The offer she made was less an ultimatum than a ritual phrased as possibility. Place the brass key against the mirror and speak one apology aloud, and one memory would be rearranged, one fracture eased and resumed. Or leave the key and the record as they were, and accept the full weight of what the silence had wrought. The choice carried the smell of damp ledger paper and the metallic tang of coins spent and never regained. It was a bargain that read like both mercy and statute, the language of legal recompense folded into an act of compassion. There exist in people private calculators that measure cost differently from reason. In that cramped booth mine came forward. I felt the brass grow suddenly heavy in my palm, the chain slick with the condensation of the place. A thin light that had been behind glass repair, potential glimmered just beyond reach. The memory that might be altered was unremarkable in its details, the small folding thing at a kitchen table, a sentence stopped half-length by fear or convenience. But the booth did not traffic in cosmetic fixes, it dealt in rearrangement. Placing the key on the mirror felt like pressing a finger to the throat of time, an intimate and invasive gesture. When I spoke, the sound that left my mouth was not the rehearsed, brittle voice I had been practicing in the dark. It came out as something other than myself, as though the apology had been pulled from some deeper, truer inventory. It was not a performance. It was a surrender, an admission that had been allowed to fester and had grown unnatural horns from being ignored. The mirror answered not with absolution but with motion. The recalled scene shifted, not erased but reformed. A face that had been turned away reoriented by the slightest tremor of recognition. A missed visit was given back, miniature and precise, as if someone had rewound and then gently nudged the film one frame at a time. The mending was not seamless. The repaired place showed the seam, the faint, visible stitch, and on the edge of the sewn patch another strain revealed itself. A hairline fracture that had been obscured by the one I had targeted. With each adjustment a new truth disclosed itself, a smaller hurt that had been sitting in the shadows. The world rearranged around that single spoken phrase, and as it did, a new knowledge settled in my gut. Restoration could be taken, it could be asked for, bought even, and yet it could demand as payment the revelation of further neglect. The cost was not merely symbolic. After I had spoken, pages of my journal that had been damp with smoke and mirror residue carried new words that were not entirely mine, but read like the ledgers afterward, rephrased memories, not softened but made truer. One repaired memory revealed another slight I had not accounted for. A kindness I had neglected, small and habitual, had become the steadying fixture in someone else's life in my absence. Where I had been allowed to mend one seam, I found the clear outline of another tear I had not seen. The brass key, cold at first, then warmed by the contact, showed wear at the edge, where it had been pressed to the mirror. It had become lighter in weight but heavier in meaning, a paradox I felt against my ribs whenever it shifted in my pocket. Leaving the booth, the fog swallowed my boots again, and the boardwalk seemed less a location than a boundary I had crossed. Dawn washed the sky in a thin gray that pretended to be clarity, the kind of light that promises definition but delivers only more outlines. My coat clung with dampness and the scarf at my collar smelled faintly of incense and the sour tang of pier rot. The carnival lights blinked on in the distance teal reflections and crimson accents that might have been celebratory in another life, but now read as sentries. I walked with a new kind of burden, honest and raw, heavier in a way that did not offer the option of shirking. There was a relief in having said one thing, but it was the kind of relief that makes further demand it. It insisted the work was not finished. At the edge of the boardwalk I turned once. Madame Lera's silhouette had already folded itself into the clutter of tents and string lights. No longer a person so much as a mechanism the corridor used to measure me by. Her outline dissolved and reformed with the fog until she was only a suggestion, a tilt of a robe, the soft bell of a charm. The Ferris wheel blinked like an eye that refuses to sleep, each revolution a slow punctuation. I left with the knowledge that apologies bought here carried echoes. The altered memory echoed against others yet unexamined, making the future feel like a corridor with more doors ajar than I had imagined. I do not know whether the repair I purchased will hold. In the weeks that followed, I woke with fragments of memory feeling patched and uneven, as though some rooms in a house I thought I knew had been rehung while others remained bare. The journal developed a new texture in my hands, water, dark smudges where admission had been pressed, sentences that read less like comfort and more like testimony. The brass key, cold then warm in my pocket, became a small, persistent weight of accountability. At unexpected times it would clink against coin or railing, and that sound served as a mnemonic consequence, has remaining power beyond the cunning of the booth. Guilt, I discovered, is not an object you remove but a geography you are condemned to walk. One apology unstopped a fountain of needed reckonings and also revealed places that had been ignored. There were people whose days I had reshaped without meaning to, the edges of my omissions folding into their routines until they had become habits I could not see. The lesson of that was blunt and dull. Silence has an architecture. It builds rooms and corridors, makes staircases where there might otherwise have been open space. And the corridor I had entered on that foggy night is not content with simple penalties. It demands excavation. Each apology is less a single payment than a down payment, and the ledger keeps making tiny noises when you think you have been done. Sometimes I find myself fingering the corner of a page and wondering if that corridor will open another door. Sometimes at odd hours the Ferris wheel seems to blink in my periphery, a polite watchfulness that starts the way guilt does, soft, then insistent. The memory the mirror reformed is imperfect but present as weight, texture, and an awkwardness that I can now touch when I let myself think of it. There is no neat absolution, there is process. There is accountability that wakes and asks for tending, slow as a garden that resists hurry. When I walk now, people pass me, and the edges of what I might have offered fold into the space between us. I practice brief apologies in the smaller rooms of my day, not for performance, but so I will not hoard more silence. I keep the journal in my pocket often enough to feel its lump, and the brass key hangs against my chest like a promise I cannot yet fully keep. The corridor still waits. Its doors remain ajar, some only cracked, others yawning like the mouths of caves. The booth of unspoken words did not free me. It taught me the price of speech and the stubbornness of consequence. It altered one memory, and in doing so showed the myriad other absences I had been carrying as ballast. It left me with a heavier honesty and a sense that the corridor has other rooms eager for my slow, difficult work. I leave this chapter in the fog, the carnival lights blinking like a distant, patient jury, knowing the record is not closed and that the next apology will find me somewhere along the path between fear and repair.